Um, Thank you, everyone, for joining us here in the late afternoon, or of course, early morning for you, Valerie. Today, we are very excited to welcome Professor Valery Forbes to our MOOC series. She is the Dean of the College of Biological Sciences at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on environmental response to stress, how these responses link through different levels in the environment, and then using this information to improve ecological risk assessment. So with research focused like that, I think we'd be hard-pressed to find more overlap with the goals of the EcoRisk project. Today, she will be talking to us about improving the use of science to inform environmental policy and decision-making. So a very warm welcome to you, Valerie, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Good morning, afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here virtually. So I thought maybe I'd say a little bit about myself and my research area first. I started off as a coastal oceanographer back in my PhD days, which was in New York, and then had an opportunity to move to Denmark for a postdoc, where I gradually got into ecotoxicology. And this kind of made a lot of sense because my PhD research was on the digestive physiology and population dynamics of mud-eating snails. And since a lot of the really nasty contaminants that get into aquatic systems end up in mud, this seemed like a natural progression. And that's more or less what I've been doing ever since. So I've spread out from marine systems to both freshwater and estuarine and marine systems, and do work that's in both ecology and ecotoxicology. I like to hope that my research, while not doing actual risk assessments, actually can improve the scientific underpinning of how we do risk assessments. And clearly, we appreciate that most organisms aren't exposed to single chemicals out in the field. So looking at multiple stressors, chemicals and other natural stressors is kind of a feature of the work. Because of the scale of our systems and the complexity of them, we can't do all this work empirically by measuring. It would take too much time. The spatial scales just aren't amenable. So increasingly, we're using mechanistic modeling to understand and predict the effects of stressors on systems. So my premise for this talk, with which I hope you agree, is that decisions that are informed by robust science are better decisions than those that aren't. And if you don't agree with that premise, you may not want to watch the rest of the talk. So for example, I'm going to go out for a walk this morning. Should I take an umbrella or not? Well, I could just flip a coin. Heads, I take one, tails, I don't. Or I could actually look at the meteorological models to make my decision. And I would argue that I'm more likely to stay dry if I use the results of the models than just a hunch or flipping a coin. So I want to talk today about what the role of science is in risk assessment and management and what the science can and can't do. So we know that ecosystems are incredibly complex and they can be difficult to wrap our heads around. So what we try to do is we simplify them by capturing the key processes that we think are going to be influential for risk. And so we create model systems. These might be physical model systems like microcosms or mesocosms, or they might be model systems that we create in a computer. And we use our model systems to hopefully capture the key processes influencing risk and use those to get our risk estimate. So where we estimate both the severity of a risk and its likelihood. And that's kind of our assessment, and that's the scientific piece. But then there's all this other stuff that comes into place, like how acceptable is the risk that we estimate? What are the economic consequences of the risk that we might calculate? What about social considerations? or the culture of the communities that are affected, politics, of course, and a variety of other factors. And it's all of these things together with our scientific output that influences the decision that is ultimately made. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that science is only part of this process. And there are a lot of different players that are involved in assessing and also managing risks. Of course, there are the chemical producers that have to estimate the risks of their products in order to put them on the market or to propose any mitigation strategies that might be needed, for example, in the area of pesticides, to allow the products to be used in the field without causing unacceptable harm. There are the regulators and the policymakers that put restrictions on what chemicals can be placed on the market. Consultants who increasingly are hired by the companies to actually help with the risk assessments, particularly as we get to more complicated so-called higher tier assessments. There's academics like me who generally don't do the risk assessments, the regulatory risk assessments, but we try to do the research that can underpin and make the procedures that we use more science-based. There are the NGOs, of course, which can play into these decisions by either lobbying, sometimes suing, especially if they're in the US, and otherwise influencing the outcomes of the decisions from the risk assessments. And then, of course, there's the public that's affected by any decisions that are made about what chemicals may or may not be permitted to be used. So a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different points of view, and that also complicates how we do the assessments and how the results are ultimately implemented. So I want to take a few minutes here to just take you through a short case study to demonstrate how using just a purely natural scientific approach to these assessments can lead to actually failure. And this was some work that I did together with Peter Kalo back in the 90s. It was funded by the UNDP, and we were hired to do an ecological risk assessment of Manila Bay in the Philippines. And just to tell you a little bit about Manila Bay, which is here, it is a very populated area. So there are about 12 million people living around the bay. There are many different sources of pollution, which we had information on. So the usual suspects, heavy metals, various oil compounds, pHs, pesticides, you name it. There's virtually no sewage treatment of any of the water flowing into the bay. And much of the population actually harvests fish and shellfish for consumption, for personal consumption. So that gives you, I think, a basic idea of what this system is like. So you're all familiar with the general approach to risk assessment, but I'll just mention it very quickly. So to estimate our risk, we combine some estimate of the concentration of chemicals that organisms are likely to be exposed to in the field, and we estimate the concentrations of those chemicals that are likely to cause effects, toxic effects on the species of concern. And the simplest way that we relate these is to create a so-called risk quotient, where we divide the expected exposure concentration by the concentration of the chemical likely to cause an effect. I draw these as distributions here because in practice, we have both uncertainties in our estimates of exposure and effect, which ideally we'd like to minimize, but we also have true variability that we really want to be sure that we capture in our risk assessments. So in exposure, we might have variability in exposure in space and time. On the effect side, we might have variability among individuals in a population or among different species that we want to protect. So in the simplest way of looking at this, we create these simple risk quotients, and if our effect concentration is higher than the concentration to which organisms are exposed, we're not too concerned. Alternatively, If the exposure concentration is higher than the concentration where we expect effects to occur, we're concerned that the risk might be unacceptable. So this is the simplest approach, and often this is the way that we start, right? With simple, realistic worst-case assumptions. If there are concerns, we would refine either our exposure or effect. We say, well, if our quotient is less than 1, so in other words, our exposure is less than the concentration at which we're expecting to see effects, we conclude that the risk is low. At a risk quotient of 1, that's kind of considered a threshold for concern. The bigger the risk quotient, if it's greater than 1, we're concerned. If it's more than 10, we're more concerned. If it's 100, we're very concerned. I think you get the idea. Well, to go back to Manila Bay, when we looked at the risk quotients for some of the most common chemicals in the bay, for metals, we had risk quotients of about 10s to 100s. So, you know, polluted. Pesticides were somewhat lower, but still risk quotients above 1, so cause for concern. Oil compounds, again, like the metals, 10s to 100s. But what really stood out for us is when we looked at the risk quotient for fecal coliforms, it was 60,000. You could practically see the bacteria with your naked eye. I mean, that is huge. And so from our perspective, it was like, wow, if you want to have an impact on cleaning up the bay, where are you going to start? I mean, you're going to start by fixing the coliform problem. And so when we concluded and we wrote up our report and you know, for us, the solution was clear. Well, if you want to have a positive impact on the water quality in Manila Bay, prioritize sewage treatment systems. Put those in as a matter of priority around the bay. This is urgent. And in the meantime, you should be warning people not to consume seafood from the bay because it has really dangerous levels of fecal coliforms. We thought, well, this is pretty straightforward. And I very clearly remember having a conversation with one of the UNDP representatives, and I was excitedly sharing the results of our analysis. And I remember she looked at me and she said, you know, well, we can't put in sewage treatment plants, that they're way too expensive, and there's absolutely no money to do this. Well, then I thought, well, then you should at least be telling people not to eat seafood out of the bay. Well, she said, if they don't consume seafood from the bay, they'll starve to death because this is all they've got. And I thought, wow, talk about a disconnect. So I think we learned a lot from this case study. I mean, first of all, it's pretty obvious that science can only take us so far, and it only provides part of the answer to these very complex environmental problems. Clearly, things like politics and economics, the cultures and traditions of the people impacted need to be part of the decision and the solution. I do think, in retrospect, that had we had an economist on our team who could have estimated what it was costing their society to not have sewage treatment in terms of medical costs, person days of lost work because people were sick from consuming seafood from the bay. It might not have seemed that sewage treatment was such a costly solution after all. But we didn't, and we should have. And I think for me, there's an important take-home message there. This work is really interdisciplinary. And if we want the results of our risk assessments, our scientific risk assessments, to really make a difference in policy and decision-making, this is a much more interdisciplinary problem that will require teams of people working together to come up with these solutions and policies. So what can science do? Well, science can tell us what we should measure, but it can't tell us what to value. So for example, typically in our toxicity tests, we measure the toxicity of chemicals. So if you can't see this on your screen, there's a dead fish down in the bottom of this beaker. Actually, it's probably not quite dead because it's not floating yet, but it will be dead soon. And this is typically what we measure, right? Simple laboratory systems, simple endpoints such as death, maybe growth, maybe reproduction. But we really honestly don't care about single dead fish. We would like populations of fish to persist in space and time. But what we really care about is all the things that fish and the aquatic systems in which they live do for us. So it might be we care about fish for consumption, or we care about having clean water bodies that aren't impacted by contaminants for recreation, or just for aesthetic values because we like looking at clear water and seeing systems that look clean. These we're now articulating as ecosystem services, all those things that ecosystems do for us that we do care about and do value. So the challenge here is that we have to link what we measure to those things that we really care about. And given the advances in technology, we're increasingly not just measuring, dead fish, but we can be much more sophisticated, and we can measure all kinds of things at the suborganismal, biochemical, molecular level. So we can expose an organism to chemicals and look at what genes get turned on and off, or what metabolites are produced. And this can be done quickly and cheaply, and that's all very good. But these responses at the suborganismal level are even further removed than death from the things that we care about. And so there's even more of a gap that has to be bridged from what we're able to measure to what we want to protect. So science can help us do this, and that's where we start talking about modeling. So let's take an example, pollination. That's something that's been a lot in the press in recent years. We're worried because pollinators are declining for various reasons, and pollination is a really important ecosystem service. Well, what do we measure? In practice, we might do toxicity tests where we relate the concentration of a particular toxic chemical with the number of dead bees. Okay, but we don't care about dead bees because dead bees isn't equivalent to pollination. So we need to go one step further, and we need to say, okay, well, how does dead bees relate to the population dynamics of bee population? So in the simplest form, population size. And these relationships aren't necessarily linear. We might have some compensation. So in other words, if you have bees in a population dying, maybe there's more food for everyone who's left. So you don't get a decline in population size right away. Okay, so these relationships can be somewhat complex. But is it really bee population size that we care about? Well, we're not quite there yet. No, because we still have to be able to relate things like bee population size or some other measure of population dynamics to the service of pollination. And again, these might not be directly proportional or linearly related. So because of this, because the responses across our levels of biological organization aren't proportional, they're typically nonlinear, and they can also be context dependent. So the only way to do this really properly, in my view, is with the aid of models. So mechanistic models where we can actually capture these processes and explore how these different relationships influence risk. So we appreciate, on the one hand, that there's a lot of complexity here, though if we look at our regulatory risk assessments, they're pretty, the word I often use is primitive. So we have, the common responses for dealing with complexity from a regulatory perspective are the following. There's great resistance to going away from using risk quotients, but risk quotients hide a lot of complexity and uncertainty. And I often say you can hide a lot of sins behind a risk quotient. We just ignore all of that complexity. And if our risk quotient's less than 1, we're good to go. We know this, but we still continue to do this anyway in many regulatory contexts. In other cases, I think we try to develop ostensibly more sophisticated approaches. So species sensitivity distributions are one, where we measure toxicity in a whole bunch of species, and then we get a probability distribution and we estimate some small percentile on that distribution and assume that that tells us something, about the safe exposure level for an ecosystem. And if you look at a lot of the literature, much of it focuses on which distribution should we use, a log normal or, some other distribution, and how many species should we put in the distribution, et cetera, which I think we're missing the forest for the trees in this one, because much of these approaches are still based on simple toxicity measures at the organismal level, so not at the population or higher ecological levels. And the species that we throw in there is kind of not representative of any real ecosystem that we're trying to protect. So I think in many respects we've missed the forest for the trees on this one. And then if we go to a lot of the academic literature, this you'll recognize as Chicken Little. What a lot of that literature you see, and us, I'll include myself in that group, writing papers saying, oh my gosh, we don't include this, we don't include that complexity or this complexity. All these things might be influencing risk, but we don't provide really practical solutions. We just raise alarms without really thinking hard about how you might do this, how you might include some of these complexities in a real regulatory decision-making context. So why has it been so hard to improve the science in our risk assessments? Well, I think there are several reasons. One is, there's a lot of time and effort needed to learn new methods. We've seen this in the conversations that we've had over the years with regulators about using more effect models, mechanistic effect models in risk assessments. They're kind of like, I'm already so busy, I just don't have time to learn these new methods. And I think there's a valid argument to be made there. We also have an unfortunate tendency, I think, to think that each time we develop a new method, that has to be added to what we already do, rather than replacing some of the older methods that we know probably don't work very well with the newer methods. There's this tendency to want to hold on to those methods that we know and love because we've used them for so many years, even if they don't really work. There are certainly various legal constraints, and certainly in the US, the EPA has to be very careful that they cannot be accused of being, and this is the term, arbitrary and capricious. So if they make a decision that is based on a newer method, they could get sued because that's a new way of doing things that previous decisions weren't based on. And so they're very concerned about not being seen to, it provides a real barrier to do anything new when you have these legal constraints in the system. And finally, change is just hard. It's just hard. People like to do what they're comfortable with, and that provides a sense of inertia. I think what I see is in the past, when we've tried to implement new methods, so for example, mechanistic models in risk assessments, they're often done at the higher tiers when, say, a chemical has failed some of the simple tiers, and models are developed to help refine either the exposure or the effects so that the risk estimate can become presumably more realistic and lower, okay? So what happens in this case, and obviously the stakes are high because we're talking about a real risk assessment. So here's the three things that could happen. Well, either your new method gives a lower risk estimate than the old method, or your new method gives a higher risk estimate than your old method, or both the new and the old methods give similar results. Well, in the first scenario, where the new method gives a lower risk, your regulators aren't happy, and they will resist using the new method because they feel that it's safer to use the old method, which gave you a lower, a lower concentration. When I say lower risk estimate, what I mean is that the kind of threshold is lower. If the new method gives a higher risk, then industry's not happy because it's going to make it harder for them to get their chemicals on the market. So they will resist using the newer method. If both give similar results, everyone's happy, but then there's no incentive at all to use the new method because, well, what benefit is there? It gives you pretty much the same results as the old method. So this kind of is a really difficult situation when we actually try to apply new methods for live risk assessments where we've got an actual chemical and stakes are high for everybody involved. So over the years, and going back at least to 2003, I've been involved with a lot of people, including Yannicka and Paul, to try to develop mechanistic effect models for ecological risk assessments. And over the years, we've had several workshops that led to reports, a CTAC special interest group, more workshops, the CREAM project, which was an ITN that was from 2009 to 2014, where we trained about 23 graduate students and a couple postdocs in mechanistic effect modeling for risk assessments. More workshops, an important opinion coming out of the National Academy of Sciences, various EFSA opinions, which have been very instrumental in getting mechanistic effect models more accepted, and plus the development of improved models that have actually begun, slowly but surely, to be used in actual risk assessments in Europe, at least. And then an initiative, a couple-year program that I led here with the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis, which tried to bring people together from the molecular level to the ecosystem level to try to develop these models. But given all this work, and I mean, there's been a lot of progress in terms of the scientific advancement, yet it's still been really hard to get them incorporated in regulatory risk assessments. And I think the reasons are because, as I mentioned, it's generally assumed that they need to be used on top of everything we already do. And everybody already feels that they're doing enough work. And if you look at some of the regulatory risk assessments, I mean, they're huge documents, right? Nobody's looking for more work. Another problem is unlike with the fate and exposure models, there hasn't been a suite of generally accepted standard models like our standard toxicity tests that, you know, everybody follows the same procedures and everybody agrees on all the details. We don't have that for the effects models, that we can just pull them off the shelf and apply them to different risk assessments. So usually these are very, what I call bespoke or custom-made models that are developed for specific higher tier risk assessments. And once they're developed, what you see happening, then they kind of are commented upon by the different stakeholders involved in the risk assessment. And it's so easy to just criticize them and poke holes in them when you've got a specific case with very high stakes. So in my view, some of the solutions to moving the work far forward is that I think we need to have these multi-stakeholder working groups where we have industry, we have the regulators, we have academics and the NGOs, people that are potentially affected. We get those groups together up front to sort of minimize the biases of the different groups, because we all do have our biases and we need to recognize that. I think we need to be doing this work outside of any actual risk assessment case so that the stakes aren't so high for any particular stakeholder, and we can sort of agree on general principles. I think if we can work together through some of the principles and the logical arguments in terms of what do we need to include, what don't we need to include, what assumptions are acceptable, what evidence do we have to building certain things in models or not. If we can agree on those in a more abstract or theoretical way, this will prevent anybody, any single group, from gaming the system and tweaking the modeling in a way that's going to be favorable to whatever outcome that they would like to achieve. I also think we need to maximize transparency in the modeling process and in the decisions that come out of them. Often what, we see, in my view, way too much of, well, we use best professional judgment. And I don't think that that's very helpful at all. Not that we shouldn't have professional judgment, but we need to be much better at articulating what that is exactly and making those judgments more transparent. And I think we need to have a process so we don't keep adding on more and more and more steps to the risk assessment. We need both a process and certain agreed upon criteria to eliminate and replace some older, less effective methods as our science improves. I think we also need more consistency and transparency in the actual model development and implementation. And for, good reasons, users and regulators who aren't modelers themselves feel very uncomfortable often using these complex models that they don't understand. And that is perfectly understandable because they've got to be the ones to make the decision. And if I were them, I would want to understand what's going into that black box that is informing my decision. So again, we have to be much better at articulating what is this expert judgment exactly. How can we make those steps more transparent? So I've been involved in some work lately, which is trying to do just this and create more both consistency and transparency in model development and implementation. And right now there's a group of us, and again, a multi-stakeholder group involving some folks from the US EPA, some folks from Syngenta, Waterborne Environmental, and my group at University of Minnesota. And we're trying to bring together some work that Sandy Raimondo and colleagues from the US EPA put forth published in 2017, I believe, providing a framework for ecological risk assessment. So to try to articulate, when do you need different types of population models that balance generality versus precision, realism, and different features of models. And so they articulated that. And in collaboration with Amelie Schmolke and colleagues, we developed a sort of what we called a decision guide to help make the actual building of a model and all the decisions that go into that much more systematic and transparent. And so at this point, we're trying to merge these two initiatives to create what we're calling POP Guide, Population Model Guidance, Use, Interpretation, and Development for Ecological Risk Assessment. The paper we're revising it at the moment. It should be coming out hopefully soon in IEAM. We're expanding this across different taxonomic groups, trying to generalize it to different types of regulatory statutes. And we're going to be demonstrating with different types of case studies to show exactly how this kind of thing will work. So that's work in progress, and I hope that this will help to create more confidence in the models and to take them out of that black box that's kind of impeded their use in risk assessments. And that's all I have. So with that, I will stop, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I can take any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you very much, Valery. That was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed the cartoons on your slides too. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? If you can, of course, either send them through the chat or unmute yourself to ask questions if you have any.
Yep.
Paul, yes.
Of course, in Europe, we're also developing population models, and what strikes me is that it's always difficult for Europe and the US to collaborate on these issues. What is your opinion on this? How should we facilitate that? Should we it's always difficult to get funding for projects between the US and Europe.
You're absolutely right. And this is something that has frustrated me for many years, as you might imagine. I mean, I think one way that we have been able to collaborate is through some of these CTAC and industry-sponsored workshops, right? Yeah. Because that has brought people together from the US and Europe and also other jurisdictions. And there we have, we have been able to collaborate even for short periods of time and produce some, I think, concrete outputs. I think, where there's hope is maybe through industry. A lot of these big companies, I mean, they really have a global reach, and they know that they're going to be, well, they have to, live within both the US regulatory framework and the European one. And I've seen, I mean, REACH there has done a lot, I think, because those companies that operate both in Europe and in the US, they kind of started moving, being that REACH in many respects was more stringent than what was available in the US. Those companies started kind of operating as if they were under REACH across the board. And I think that helped to push things as well. I mean, I think EFSA, as I said briefly, has done an outstanding job in helping to move the effect modeling forward by their opinions and by allowing models in principle to be used in risk assessments. And I think now they're further ahead than the US EPA. What complicates things is that, so like EFSA or the other EU regulatory bodies don't have their own research branches. Yeah. Right. So they need
EFSA know a bit.
Yeah, right. Whereas the EPA, they have their own research branch, and they don't like using models that they haven't produced themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a barrier.
Okay. Thank you.
Sam, you have a question?
Yeah, fantastic talk. Thank you very much for that. I was really interested to hear your example about being in the Philippines, where you've done risk assessment, as we understand it, as best as it can be done, but you run up against sort of people with different agendas and unintended consequences and so on. Are there any? Can you point to any wins where you've been able to work with, or where other people have been able to work with economists? Because we talk a lot about where risk assessment hasn't worked as well as we'd like it to. Are there sort of similar examples where lessons have been applied and you can point to as best practice? Sorry, that was a bit incoherent.
I'm sure there are specific examples, but and my mind will inevitably go completely blank in trying to draw one. I think in those cases where people have brought together the more interdisciplinary teams, where you've had the biologists, the chemists with the social scientists. I think that those kinds of approaches are definitely going to be much more likely to succeed. I mean, when I look back on what we did in the Philippines, it was really a very blinkered natural scientific approach. But I'm trying to think of any specific case that I could hold up as, yes, this is a success. I don't know. Paul, can you think of any? Yannicka, do you have any that come to mind immediately?
Well, I have some in mind, and that's because we used to have an environmental economy group here at NIVA, or we still have. Yeah. Anyway, I used to collaborate with an environmental economist who sadly has left NIVA. We used to work on Bayesian network modeling, both environmental and economic components in the same model. For me, that was very, I found that very fruitful. How well that was applied, or how much stakeholders were engaged, I'm not sure. at least it did involve economy, so we could argue about ecosystem services and values and so on. So I have some examples where that was done.
I mean, in principle, the ecosystem services framework, I think, should be really helpful if we can put, if we can bring in the economics to it and demonstrate the value of what ecosystems are doing for us. But of course, it's easy to say that, but when you start getting into the details of how you put values on those things, now that's very contentious, obviously, and there's a lot of different views and whose values, and I don't think we can get into that today. But I think in those cases where the people being affected are brought into the decision making, that's likely to lead to more effective solutions than not.
And values can be measured more objectively than by values of ecosystem services, like the cost of alternative foods. If you don't eat seafood, what should you eat instead? And the cost of water treatment and so on. So there are ways to model.
Yeah, it's those cultural values that start getting a little tricky.
Can I comment on that? Because for the PFAS, there is a European report now about the cost of inaction. It's the cost of what to health and to cleaning up systems if you don't do any action on the PFAS. And the cost is tremendous. I don't remember the numbers, but it's the cross-European cost and also a Nordic for the Scandinavian countries.
Yes.
So that is an example of the cost of inaction.
Yeah. Well, and alternatively, I could imagine one could also potentially estimate costs of applying the precautionary principle, right? And what are the costs of banning something when maybe it's not necessary, or maybe, you could relax your regulation without completely banning something, and what are the costs and benefits there? And we tend not to do that so much, but I could see that being useful as well.
Just to add on that, I've come to think of the sort of risk assessment done by regulators as trading risks off against each other rather than striving to minimize risk. And of course, in the EU, any pharmaceutical substance, which is what I'm working on, will get approved for market if it passes its medical risk assessment, regardless of its environmental risk. But there must still be. I'm out of a job if there isn't a way to show that we can reduce environmental risks as much as possible with minimal impact on medical risks, and likewise for pesticides and all of the other chemicals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Matt, you had a question?
Yeah, do you guys hear me okay? I'm outside.
We hear you, yes.
Okay, very good. I think I have a question that's sort of similar to what Annika has written in the chat, because you were talking about these multi-stakeholder groups and when you talk about trying to do this work in an environment where the stakes are not high, I think you're talking about specific case studies for industry is an obvious example. My experience in working on these multi-stakeholder groups is that the industry does not have their own products in mind when they're participating in developing science to support policy. And I think this is kind of an inherent problem, because they can bring to bear so many resources that are dedicated around their approach to the problem that's automatically informed by their own business interests, that there's an asymmetry. Their resources are so much bigger, and often they're smart people. They've already thought ahead what the implications of all the different possible pathways that the discussions could go are, and they push you down the pathway that is best for their product. Am I too cynical? Do you have any positive case studies you could tell me about, or should industry be banned from these discussions?
I don't think industry should be banned from these discussions. I mean, certainly there's the argument to be made that industries generally are in the business of, I mean, they have to make money, they have to make a profit or they won't survive. But when I've collaborated, and a lot of our workshops have involved scientists from industry, and I've had research projects with scientists from industry, I mean, these are scientists who were trained just like we were. And so they've gone on to work in a company rather than staying in a university or going to work for the government. But they're scientists. And in my experience at that level, they really care about the science and about doing good science. And I mean, it's really not in their interest to put a product on the market that's going to have, you know, awful impacts, because it's going to come back to bite them, and that's just bad business.
Is it not in their interests? Like, what about the Volkswagen cheating on the emissions for of the diesel cars? Like, it depends on time frames, doesn't it?
Well, I would say that one did come back to bite them. And I think when we're talking about the scientists working in industry, I think they have different motivations. I mean, clearly they may have a different bias than the regulatory scientists. But in my personal experience, I have seen, and I've worked with people from all of the different sectors who really care about getting the science right. And so I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I should clarify. I'm trying to be devil's advocate a little bit here, because I don't want to impugn any individuals, certainly. And It's hard to pick individuals. But I somehow think the system is so stacked, because even a scientist who works in an industry, in a company, they're stewing in that company's culture. And even if they want to do the best thing, I think they turn into someone who thinks the best thing is aligned with the interests of the company, just because of some sort of indoctrination, or that this is a possibility. I don't know if there's any literature on this. Yeah, that just by being within this group whose goals are all aligned toward profit maximization and, you know, product stewardship, do you lose sight of the bigger goals, I guess, is the question.
Well, I guess that's why I would argue for bringing, you know, then you also bring the government regulatory people in, scientists, right, who have a different bias and a different perspective. And I would argue that we in academia, we are biased to find wow results, right? So if it is in our best interest as academics, if we want to get promoted and cited and what have you, funded, to you know, if I publish a study saying, oh, this pesticide causes deformities in some charismatic species, I might get on the front cover of Science or Nature. If I show that same chemical is probably okay, I'm not going to have an easy time getting published, and no one's going to cite me. You know, so we have our own biases and our own agenda as well, I'm afraid. So that's why I would argue getting us all, you know, to work together on these things is probably our best chance at making progress.
Annika, since your question was really related, did you want to come in and either ask a different or similar question or have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, for your great talk. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, my question was coming from the same sort of impression that Matt, like you discussed it now. So like there's stakeholders that have like their aims. So when you described that there might be these multi-stakeholders working groups, and that they could work on like a topic outside of the life risk assessment, I was just wondering what that could be. Like I can see why you would do that in academia, like you just go into a topic to find out like the baseline truth. I don't know, but for other stakeholders, what would be an outside era operation space? So maybe you can elaborate on that?
I could definitely, so for example, on one of my slides, I showed the example of the Modellink workshops. And this was a series of 2 workshops where we brought a group of stakeholders together to work intensively for, it was about a week or 5 days in each of 2 sessions. And we broke out into smaller groups and developed case studies, and this was focused on pesticide risk assessment, and we developed and worked on case studies for different taxonomic groups. And we had very heated discussions, don't get me wrong. I mean, there was a lot of disagreements about what you needed to include and not include, and was this a valid assumption and what have you. But it was for pesticides, and we even could narrow it down because you had to have certain parameters for your pesticide that you could, model. But it was, I mean, I think partly what it did was it built trust among those people because we were jointly trying to solve the problem of coming up with a case study to show a proof of concept of how modeling could help you get a more because we all should want to have more accurate risk assessments. And then despite the fact that you could have very different perspectives and heated arguments about the specific technical details, then in the evening, you'd sit around and have a meal together and a glass of wine, and you got to know each other as people and realized that, that other person from this other group was not evil and, was actually a sincere scientist trying to do a good job. And I think that brought people together. I just did another one on soil earthworm modeling. In fact, the paper's just available in IEAM this week. And that again brought together a group of people from the regulatory authorities, some of the consultants, the companies, and then a few academics to think about how one could develop soil earthworm modeling for pesticide risk assessment. And it was kind of the same thing, very different perspectives, arguments and disagreements, and it was challenging to get consensus on some of the points, but we did, and everybody pretty much bought into it. And I think that's helpful.
The key might be to just bring the people on the same table before you start using the method, develop the method together. Yeah, precisely.
That's exactly right. And that's what I was trying to get at, that you're together developing the model. You're not like someone develops a model and says, here, use my favorite toy, because that I don't think is going to work. So yeah.
Thank you.
I would just like to add a comment. As you know already, Valery, in this ITN, we have these partner organizations from industry and government who will act as supervisor for the students and host their comments. And next month or the following month, we will have a seminar where the students will present their projects, where all these partner organizations are invited. So maybe there is hope for
I think that's
group of scientists.
I think that's really important. It's just really important because otherwise when you're in academia, you can come out with advice that just that's just unrealistic because you don't really see what the regulators have to deal with in their day-to-day work. And how much it is and what constraints they operate under. So I think having the PhD students have the opportunity to work closely with the regulatory authorities and or with people in the companies is just a fantastic opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Taylor, for sending the link to that paper. Janneke, do you have another question?
Yes. Well, I was thinking when you talked about the refinement of SSDs and how we continue using the same methods and so on, just building upon them instead of doing something completely new. So from my experience here in our group, I think we've started with quite open minds, we do the spatial network modeling, we can put anything in there. But what really limits us is the data available. So we work on existing data. We have looked in-house databases and EPA databases, various sources, and what we get mostly is NOx and low-X and these values that people have said for 10 years, maybe stop using NOx and low-X, but that's what we get. That's what we can find. We would be happy to use those response curves and more detailed data, but that's just so much more effort to get those kind of more detailed data. So I don't expect you to have the right answer, but just, yeah. Or do you have any thoughts about how we can better deal?
I mean, the data are critical, and I hope in my presentation, I certainly don't mean to ever imply that, once we have our models, we don't need data. I think a really critical part of all this is that feedback loop between, the data that informs your models and lets you build better models that you then have to test with data. And so there's this, it's, part of the modeling cycle. Like you, it is frustrating when you actually go to do the work and you see how few data are available. I can speak from my own experience right now. We've been trying to do some population modeling for endangered species, those that are listed under the Endangered Species Act, where there's almost no data on them at all. And so we're trying to, use various statistical, phylogenetic, life history categorization methods to try to fill the data gaps and see if we can justify using non-listed species where we do have more data to fill in the data gaps and create models based on the non-listed species that we can use kind of as surrogates for the listed species. But, I think you're right. As long as people keep generating these NOx, it's hard to move forward. There have been some movements, and I'm reminded from this earthworm workshop, one of the recommendations is to change the standard earthworm test that's used at the lowest tier from a kind of ANOVA design to a more regression type design that would let you get a dose response. So, I don't know. I guess we keep advocating.
But that's good to hear, because that's exactly what we've been talking about. Also using, or one of the things we're talking about, using regressions instead of ANOVA.
Yeah, but, like you said, people have been making this argument for years, and it's like, turning a super tanker. But and this is what I saw from my CREAM experience. Before CREAM, I felt like there were a few of us that were lonely voices calling out in the desert. And once we had CREAM, suddenly we had this critical mass of young scientists that, were all kind of saying, like, we need to do this. And it made a difference. It moved the needle. And now a lot of these fellows are out working in the consulting firms, working in the regulatory authorities or in industry, and it is making change. So you're the hope for the future.
Well, it is 5 o'clock here, and that was an extremely positive note to end on, if we're ready to end. If there are no any other questions. Okay, I do not see any other ones coming in the chat or anyone else. So thank you again very much, Valery. This was a really fantastic talk and a really great discussion afterwards. Well,
thank you all. Thank you for tuning in, and thanks for the good discussion.
Thank you very much, Valery.
Absolutely, anytime. And without jet lag, it's wonderful. All right, well, have a good weekend. And
have a nice weekend. Enjoy it.
Enjoy the snow.
Yeah, right.